welcome to the January 23rd Council Work Session. And our first item of business is clear and objective housing approval criteria. I'll turn that over to you, Manager, or directly to Alyssa. Manager.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Janessa Dragovich. I'm the project manager on the Clear and Objective Update. And to my right is Alyssa Hansen. She's a principal planner and is my backup for big questions. I was here in November. She's my history. I was here in November when we covered batch 1 recommendations for addressing the key issues identified for the Clear and Objective Update. Today we're going to walk through the recommendations for batch 2. First, I thought I'd give a quick project refresher. So state law requires that we have clear and objective standards for land use application types that involve housing. So that's for land divisions, planned unit developments, or PUDs, conditional uses, and site reviews. The goal of the Clear and Objective project is simple. It's to improve efficiency and effectiveness in our clear and objective process. We can achieve this through changes that do the following: mitigate barriers to housing, increase efficiency and predictability, and effectively address development impacts. Improving predictability and ensuring neighborhood compatibility are not mutually exclusive goals. Throughout this project, we've taken an and both approach. How do we remove barriers, improve efficiency, and preserve neighborhood compatibility? A best outcome would be to adopt changes that offer both predictability and compatibility. Besides, predictability is actually good for everybody. The Clear and Objective project was intentionally designed to allow this incremental review through the phasing of the project. Each phase builds on the last. The work we do next is based on the decisions that we make now. Today we're looking to advance the second batch onto the third phase so that we can start drafting proposed code changes. The Public and Planning Commission will review and refine draft code before we bring it back to you in April. At that point, we'll be asking for consideration to move forward with the formal adoption process, shown here as phase 4. Just a reminder that the batch approach we took was to allow more time on the 8 more complex issues in batch 2. No comments were received during the extended comment period, but Planning Commission was able to spend two additional work sessions devoted to batch 2 recommendations. A reminder that the draft solutions we'll be going over today are conceptual in nature, and they're designed to narrow our focus for the code writing process. Review of draft code language will happen in phase 3. These are the batch 2 items in the order that we'll go over them. They cover geotechnical and slope issues, transportation, trees, and a handful of PUD issues. Planning Commission had robust discussion on each issue before taking a straw poll vote about whether they supported the draft recommendation. This was very helpful, and in several instances, their comments provided extra guidance for the draft code writing process. In all but one case, their input didn't require modification of the original recommendation and can be carried forward as we draft code. Now I'll give you a brief overview of each issue, the draft recommendation, and the Planning Commission's feedback, and then I can take questions at the end. So we'll start with 2 issues that are related to geotechnical analysis and slope. The first issue is the geotechnical requirement. The purpose of the geotechnical analysis is to ensure that development on potentially unstable soils is located, designed, and constructed safely. Simply put, we want roads that aren't going to slump, and we want buildings that aren't going to fall downhill, or I guess slide downhill. Currently, we require professional certification that the development won't be impacted by these limited risk factors. If it will, then they also must provide methods to address them, and then we have the applicant state that they'll develop accordingly. The recommendation is to revise our current requirement to address additional risk factors. Something to keep in mind is that this early in the process, the geotechnical evaluation is focused on suitability for future development. It's meant to inform road location and lot configuration. Planning Commission supported this recommendation with a straw poll vote of 6-1. The second issue is the 20% grading prohibition. And as I said, this one is related to the geotechnical requirement. For subdivisions and PUDs reviewed under Clear and Objective, any grading on slopes 20% or greater is strictly prohibited. This may preclude development under clear and objective for sites with slopes and may not be the most effective or efficient way to address potential impacts. It's really a blunt tool for addressing concerns about slope. A few points on buildable slopes before I get to the recommendation. The discretionary tract does not prohibit grading on any slopes. This criterion also seems mismatched with other buildable lands requirements. For example, the state recognizes up to 25% slopes as developable, and Eugene's Buildable Lands Inventory, or BLI, used up to 30% slopes based on the existing patterns of development. So our recommendation for this one is to rely on a more robust geotechnical requirement in lieu of the strict prohibition. And we would do this by ensuring that the revisions to the geotechnical criteria also address slope stability in the context of road layout and lot locations. The Planning Commission supported this approach with a straw poll vote of 7-0. Next, we'll move on to transportation issue. This is one remaining issue. It relates to the street standards modifications. There are stated maximums for block length, street connectivity, and cul-de-sac or emergency vehicle turnarounds. In an ideal system, streets can be laid out in a grid like shown. However, for many areas in Eugene, this just isn't feasible. Topography, natural resources, or existing development can make it difficult to impossible to achieve the grid layout. The existing standards do allow for exemptions when these conditions preclude a connection, but the term preclude may be problematic for clear and objective. To improve clarity and consistency, our recommendation is to revise the code to allow clear and objective exceptions to the extent possible, and then also allow an adjustment review option for situations that merit more flexibility. Planning Commission supported this recommendation 7-0. Next, we'll move on to trees. So trees are very important, and so is accommodating growth within our urban growth boundary. Tree preservation is intended to help balance the protection of our urban forest while supporting a healthy economy, housing that's affordable, and compact urban development. That said, the existing requirement under clear and objective isn't very effective. It comes down to the applicant showing that consideration was given to preserve trees. That's a very low bar. So to better achieve the purposes of the tree preservation standards, our recommendation is to revise the criterion to require preservation or mitigation and implement a rating scale based on tree type, health, size, and location. The rating scale would identify existing trees subject to the requirement, so we could fine-tune and not necessarily require preservation of trees that are non-native or invasive. And then a minimum level of preservation or mitigation would be required. Note that I keep saying preservation or mitigation. Part of this recommendation is building in the mitigation as well, making this a much more effective tool to get at tree preservation. So this one, the Planning Commission supported the recommendation 7-0 as well. The final category has 4 issues related to PUDs. The PUD process is intended to provide a high degree of flexibility in the design of the site and the mix of land uses. It's our most robust land use application, and it gets reviewed by a hearings official. A PUD can either be required, for instance, from an overlay zone based on the use, or due to a refinement plan such as the South Hill study that we'll talk about soon. Or because they can offer extra flexibility, they can also be voluntary. Our first PUD is the 1 acre open space, accessible open space requirement. The purpose is for residents to have accessible and convenient open space. The current requirement is that all proposed development be within a 1/4 mile radius of an accessible recreation area, or open space at least 1 acre in size be available to residents, in other words, provided on site. I also want to point out that open space can come in a lot of shapes and sizes. As seen here, you can see the open space can be single-family yards, it can be common open space on a development site, it can be local natural areas or parks or playgrounds. For the working groups, we mapped the buildable land inventory overlaid with a 1/4 mile radii from existing schools, parks, and open space. I'll zoom in closer in a second, but what we found was that many parts of Eugene already meet this requirement. This is just an excerpt from South Eugene, but it does look like this most of the city. However, there are some areas like this one I zoomed in on where smaller undeveloped or underdeveloped lands remain. So just to point out on this map, the solid yellow properties were from the 2012 inventory, and those were undeveloped. The ones that have the yellow outline are underdeveloped, and then green sites are park sites. We're going to look at a few of these excerpts for a couple of these issues. So requiring 1 acre of on-site open space can be prohibitive to development for these smaller sites. Our recommendation on this one is to revise the required distance from existing public open space from 1/4 mile to 1/2 mile and use a scalable standard if on-site open space is required. For reference, 1/4 mile to 1/2 mile is about a 5 to 10 minute walk, which is pretty convenient. For sites not within the 1/2 mile distance, allowing a scalable on-site open space option would still provide access to open space without posing a barrier to development, especially for those smaller infill sites that we were looking at. Some of those sites are not much more than 1 acre to begin with. Planning Commission supported this option 7-0. Okay, so the last 3 issues are related to criteria that are intended to implement South Hills study policies in a clear and objective way. So I thought I'd do a quick primer on the study, which is a refinement plan, before we proceed. Eugene's ridgeline is one of our most visually significant features. It's the visual boundary of the southern edge of our city. In 1974, before we even had an urban growth boundary, we adopted the South Hills study in recognition of the importance of protecting and preserving this irreplaceable asset. It applies to all land south of 18th Avenue and above 500 feet in elevation. The authors acknowledged that future growth would occur here and aimed to balance the goals of utilizing the hillside areas for development while preserving their natural character. To achieve these goals, they laid out several recommendations, which are now adopted policies. There was a focus on identifying future park lands and preserving highly visible areas from an intensive level of development. Most development in the South Hills study area requires a PUD, and it's worth noting that the study is over 4 decades old, and at the time it was written, much of the study area was undeveloped. A lot of its aspirations have since been realized in the successful acquisition of our Ridgeline Trail system and park system, and development that has occurred at lower elevation, lower density, and with preservation of natural sources consistent with the study policies. Our first issue is a limitation that no development on land above 900 feet in elevation occur except that 1 dwelling per lot that existed prior to 2001 is allowed. The purpose was to preserve land at higher elevations from that intensive level of development. It appears the greater intent was to ensure the city's ability to acquire parkland as the hills developed, to guide the selection of those parklands, and to require private areas proposed for preservation through a PUD process to serve similar purposes as those laid out for the parks. The operative term here again is intensive level of development. The discretionary track allows development under a PUD when consistent with the purposes in the Ridgeline Park section. The purposes are largely focused on park site suitability and preserving the most visually prominent and biologically valuable areas. As I mentioned before, at the time of the study was written, a substantial amount of this property was undeveloped. The Ridgeline Trail system and several parklands had not yet been acquired. This is an excerpt from another map that we used for the working groups and with the Planning Commission that shows the area around Spencer Butte. The crosshatches are land over 900 feet in elevation. And again, solid yellow is undeveloped or was as of 2012. And outlined in yellow is underdeveloped, so it could further develop. And the green is the city-owned parklands. As you can see, we have acquired a significant amount of parkland above 900 feet, the area identified as high view potential in the study. As shown in Eugene's Parks and Recreation System Plan, there are no remaining ridgeline sites identified for acquisition within the urban growth boundary. That said, other concerns may still merit protection of these high elevation areas from an intensive level of development. Our recommendation is to revise the criterion to allow less intensive development, that is, limit the density to 2.5 units per acre, above 900 feet in elevation, and include additional tree and vegetation preservation requirements. We do have some precedent to go on in defining that intensity threshold. Development has been occurring under discretionary PUD review, consistent with South Hill study policies, at an average of the recommended 2.5 units per acre. This is also the density assumed for land over 900 feet in our buildable land inventory. So Planning Commission supported this recommendation 6-1. Next, under the clear and objective track, all development must be set back 300 feet from the urban growth boundary. The policy recommendation that this appears to come from states that all development shall be reviewed for potential linkages with or to the Ridgeline Park system. This is an excerpt of another map that we used, and the dashed line here represents the 300-foot setback from the urban growth boundary. Here's another map of the same area. On this one, the dark purple areas, the little square boxes to the right, are areas that are over 900 feet in elevation. So those are your higher view potential areas. I'd like to point out that much of the area shown along the urban growth boundary is under 900 feet in elevation, yet still subject to the 300-foot setback. You can see that the urban growth boundary does not precisely follow the ridge line, so the setback also may be an ineffective tool. It is also potentially an inefficient use of buildable land, considering that we have completed the ridgeline trail system, which, as you may recall from the policy that I read, really appears to tie into linkages to the ridgeline trail system. Because of all that, our recommendation is to revise the requirement to make the setback only apply to the areas above 900 feet in elevation. This would be more effective and precise, as only the areas above this elevation that might actually include ridge lines would be affected, and buildable lands below could be used more efficiently. Planning Commission supported this recommendation 7-0. Our last issue requires that development cluster buildings so that at least 40% of the development site is retained in common open space area. The study policy that this one comes from is quite lengthy and is provided in the draft report in your agenda item summary, so I won't read it all here. The overall purpose, though, is to get developments to be responsive to natural factors and to preserve natural character, and to do this by encouraging the clustering of development in low elevation, low slope, lower visual impact, and less vegetated areas, and conversely, to preserve high elevation, high slope, high visual impact, and highly vegetated areas. That's clearly a challenge to translate into clear and objective standards. You would have to address how to resolve any of a number of conflicts. For example, what do you do when the least sloped areas are at the highest elevation? The original recommendation tried to get it at least reducing the requirement, since the 40% figure is arbitrary, realizing, of course, that the 30% that we proposed is also arbitrary. However, it does, to some extent, encourage clustering. The existing requirement may inhibit efficient use of land by preserving large areas of otherwise buildable land, especially when applied at lower elevation areas that may be less visible and where we may want more development. Planning Commission's straw poll for the original recommendation came back at 2-4 with one person neutral. Instead, they supported an alternative combination of two of the possible concepts we had brought to the working groups. Basically, it would rely on other requirements such as lot coverage limits and open space requirements for multifamily developments that already apply. The straw poll for this alternative came back with 5 in support, 1 still wanting more information, and 1 against. So before I take questions, I wanted to let you know that we have a lot going on in the next few months. We're in open comment now for batch 1 draft code. In February, we'll spend a work session or 2 reviewing and refining that draft language with Planning Commission. We'll also draft code language for batch 2 and get that out for open comment before spending 2 work sessions with Planning Commission on that draft language in March. and then we'll return to you in April to go over the draft code for both batches. So now I'm ready for questions.
Thank you. That was a lot of information in
Sorry.
very discreet form, but it's supported, and so hopefully everyone actually read the packet. And thank you very much for that. It's a lot of work, and it's very detailed. I have Betty already in the queue. I'm sure I need Mike in the queue. You, Claire,
Number 2. Are you number 2?
Alan. Okay. Okay. I'll take it away, Betty.
Thank you. I find this really alarming, the whole thing. The South Hills study is a refinement plan, correct? And refinement plans are legal. They carry the force of law, right? They're hard to get to. They're hard to create. They take a lot of time. They involve a great number of residents. And apparently it's easy to destroy them. It looks as if you have here steps toward destroying the South Hills study, piece by piece. And if it's so hard to create it, shouldn't it be, is there a legal process for dismantling it? That's my question.
I don't believe that we are dismantling it. The recommendations where we're revising criteria, it's to better support the actual policy recommendations that are laid out in the study as it exists now. It's not to dismantle it. There are areas where we feel that we could better meet the goals of the policies.
And just to be clear, when we come forward through a formal adoption process, we will have to include with the ordinance findings that support that this is in conformance with the South Hills study. So we can't toss out the South Hills study as part of this. We have to show how any code amendments that you all adopt are actually consistent with the South Hills study.
I guess you can show anything. So the residents have to, before you get a refinement plan, the residents have to be involved, the people who live in that area, right?
When we do refinement planning or neighborhood planning, we do involve neighborhoods, yes,
And,
similar to River
and they
Road.
don't have to be involved when you change it?
We're not changing the South Hills study plan itself. These are merely amendments to the land use code.
They're pretty big changes, really.
And we have involved members of the public through this entire process that Janessa kind of showed you the phased process. And one of the reasons it is phased is because we have a lot of touch points for folks to be involved. So these recommendations, just to be clear, it's outlined in your packet, but they came through a working group that involved.
I know about the group, I know.
Okay,
I read the whole thing, I know.
great.
But it's not the same kind of process as the years, months, and sometimes years it takes to get a refinement plan.
It could be different processes. But I think what we're saying is this particular process also includes any numbers of people as part of that, and the formal adoption process will provide additional opportunities for people to weigh in on any of these kinds of things as well.
Well, I hope people get informed and know what's happening before it. But these are pretty drastic things when you change the setback, for example, the open space requirement. Incidental question, I hear you say that someone's private yard would count as open space?
Not necessarily count. I was pointing out that open space comes in many different types. So single-family
I'm wondering if my
residences,
fenced yard might contribute to an open space.
not to the specific criterion. No.
I don't live up on the high hills anyway, but
And I
I
want to
think-
clarify one thing. So the policies themselves, it doesn't say there's a 300-foot setback, and it doesn't prohibit development of 900. That's what the existing clear and objective approval criteria do, and so we're trying to match those up better with what the South Hills study says itself.
And I notice you are saying there's not that much space required. A part of the reason for the space was for wildlife passage and habitat. So it isn't just for the narrow path. That's all for now, but I will be voting against it. because I think it's drastic changes. Thank you.
Okay, Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I have two large areas of questions, I guess. Actually, I have a lot of questions here. Get to that in the second point. Here's the first one. Maybe you can recommend something to me. One of the things I notice here, for example, in the geotechnical requirement, the COS 13 stuff, the purpose is to ensure that development in areas with potentially unstable soil conditions are located, designed, and constructed in a manner that provides for public health, safety, and welfare. That seems reasonable to me. That sounds really good. But we're setting up the code to do a lot by lot analysis when it's time to build something and saying, essentially, what constraints ought to apply in this particular lot because of these circumstances. I would like to get us to a place where we consider on a lot-by-lot basis what ought or ought not to and at what percentage be included in the buildable lands inventory based on the same constraints. At the beginning, when we're saying this is buildable land or it's not, rather than at the end when it's time to build something on it. If I wanted that analysis done in advance so that we had a more accurate buildable lands inventory on what was actually buildable and everybody was clear up front about how to build on it, and it was truly clear and objective, then how would one change our process in order to see that take place from your perspective?
I'm trying to understand what you're asking. So
We do a process. We called it ECLA when we went the first time to say, okay, Eugene Comprehensive Lands Assessment, here are the lands. We, by certain standards and criteria, for example, included all the 30% slopes or a good chunk. Well, I don't want to get too far into all the arguments, but we said that's buildable. Okay, it's actually buildable when it comes time to build on it, based on constraints. I would rather see us constraining what we're calling buildable up front than what we are constraining when it comes time to build on it, and thus being clearer and more objective about how people build and what their expectations of that ought to be. If you were going to recommend a process by which that were altered in how we do our business and how we plan, what would you suggest?
I just need a little bit more clarification. They can answer for themselves, but can you give an example of what you're thinking about? I'm still not quite clear of what you're asking.
Can I ask a clarifying? Are you asking how to revise the buildable lands inventory to remove unbuildable lands based on?
It seems to me there's a
Geotechnical?
disconnect between what we call buildable lands and what we constrain the building of that we're calling buildable lands. If all were truly buildable that we are calling buildable lands, and we use the same criteria for counting them that we do for building on them, I'm trying to figure out how we meld those processes more closely than they exist today. And I only have a few
And I
seconds here,
think
so I'm
maybe
going to
we'll
need
have to
around
get
two.
back to you because I'm still not quite sure what you're asking, so.
This question occurred to me on the fly
Yeah.
here, and it needs further formulation for an intelligent conversation. Mayor, I need a second round because my second question is more important than this one.
All right, Claire.
Thanks. I had a chance to meet with staff yesterday and get some questions answered, so I don't have a lot of questions, but one that just occurred to me right now is under the tree preservation. You talked about strengthening the language there to make it more clear that it's not just consider the trees, but actually come up with an evaluation of the trees and what's the potential for doing different things regarding the trees. So you talked about mitigation. Is mitigation required under the other building processes we have in the same way that it's being suggested here?
It's reviewed more on a case-by-case. There's more discretion in that process around tree removal and preservation requirements. But yes, sometimes mitigation is required, and you may need to replant 2 trees for every one you cut down, or there can be a ratio applied.
Okay, thanks. I was just wanting to see how that interacted with all of the different ways. Okay, that was my one question. Thank you.
All right, Alan.
This is a mixed bag for me. Some of it is improvements in getting to clear and objective, and some of it seems like clear and objective and weaken. So the ones I don't have a problem with, the ones you started with, which are the geotechnical requirement, which I think is a good change. 20% slope, I think is a good change. And the streets modification, I think is an okay change. When I start to then think about the tree one, I think that seems like a good change. Did you also say that in that one, there's a minimum level required?
Right, we
What
would
does that
set
mean?
that. Well, for right now, they only have to show that they considered saving trees.
Yeah.
There's no minimum level of preservation required. So we would establish some minimum level of preservation or mitigation on the site. So we would,
Like what?
we haven't gotten there yet on drafting code.
Could be a
We're-
percentage, it could be.
And it would only apply if there are existing trees
Okay.
potentially to be
So
preserved.
that would come back to us
Yeah.
as language that we'd see. So that one's okay with me. When I get to the open space one, 1 acre, I'm unclear, let me go through these and you can come back to them. I'm unclear why we would weaken it to go, it seems like we're weakening it to go from 1/4 to a half a mile as the distance from an open public space. I'm not, I read the stuff, I still didn't understand why that is a better way to go. It seems like it's a weakening of that criteria. On the limitation over 900 feet, that seems like it's increasing development on 900 feet, which is what the South Hill study was supposed to preserve, and therefore, even though it's less intensive development, it seems like a weakening of that requirement. And then on the ridgeline setback, that changes it to, changes it to only above 900 feet. It seems like a weakening of the South Hill study requirements. And then finally, the 40% open space requirement, changing it from 40 to 30 is clearly a weakening of it. So I'm, as of right now, it's a mixed bag for me. I can support the first set, but then when I get to the open space and the South Hill study stuff, I think we're going backwards.
So I think that's a great point, and I'm glad you brought those up so that I can bring up something else. All of those are PUD requirements, and I want to point out that since 2003, we've seen over 50 PUD applications, and only 5 of them have gone through the clear and objective track. So these are requirements that are specific to the clear and objective review track. They don't apply to the discretionary. So on all those other 45 plus applications, we're not getting a 300-foot setback. We're not necessarily getting 40% open space, where it doesn't have the parks, the requirement for 1 acre on-site open space. So these are requirements that it's not, the development pattern that you see on the hills now is not reflective of an application of these criteria, because these criteria to a great extent have been avoided, and people have opted for the discretionary track. So one of the things that, that was one of the reasons behind the genesis of this project, was that the clear and objective criteria were seen as overly restrictive, and making that review track not as viable an option for some people. So that's part of what we've been looking at, is how do we reduce some barriers? How do we make it a little more efficient and predictable and reasonable, but also still try to get at to preserve the reason that these criteria are here. So that's the basis of our recommendations. They're not trying to weaken things, but it recognizes that we're not getting these now to a large extent because people aren't using the track.
So the discretionary track stays, and we're clarifying the clear and objective standard. And in the South Hills area, what you're saying is that 45 out of 50 went through the discretionary track because the clear and objective was too onerous, and we're making the clear and objective comply with what we're seeing happen in the discretionary track, and so that it's easier to go through the process to develop a PUD in the South Hills area.
Consistent with how we've seen developments actually occur. So like the 2.5 units per acre, the density over 900 feet, the limitation to one house on an existing lot as of 2001 doesn't apply to the discretionary track. And the South Hill study allows more development than that under the PUD process. And then, again, it's under that process through the discretionary track that each of those PUDs that's occurred has had to show consistency with the South Hill study. And in doing so, what has come out of that is an average development of 2.5 units per acre. So that's what we use to kind of guide some of these changes that may seem like they're weakening, but they're really kind of consistent with what we've seen under discretionary.
Well, they are weakening it, but they're making it more realistic.
Right.
So in your opinion, moving forward, if we don't adopt these, we'll just continue to have people go through the discretionary tract and adopt these anyway? Or have these?
Well, not adopt these anyway.
Well, but have these as requirements anyway.
Correct. It would continue as it's been.
Right, which is 45-5 in terms of
Right.
going through the track. So, so what we're doing is facilitating the process by adopting rules that people are currently doing in the discretionary track.
Somewhat, yes.
Right, you need to think about that for a minute.
Okay. Emily?
Right.
Thank you, and thank you, Janessa, for reaching out to us and I'm really sorry I didn't manage to get it together to get back. I do wish that we had either put these in the order, grouping them from the get-go, and not switched them up, because, you know, my thought process was that way, and now I'm all scrambled. Anyway, thank you for the report. My biggest consideration is number 11 with the tree preservation. Trees are really critical for so many reasons, and with our needs to really work on the CRO, trees help with, you know, sucking back up that carbon, and we really need more of them. When we were in Charlotte for the National League of Cities conference, and this might not be exactly correct, but they have a phenomenal, like 50% foliage cover in a relatively short time, and they are just planting trees every place there's a spot. So I think we should be doing that also. So the consideration that we have now, do we have any data as to what that did? How many trees lost, how many preserved? And, you know, it'd just be nice to know what the results of what we're doing now is. I don't think just consideration is enough. For mitigation, would that have to occur within Eugene city limits? Because I think that's pretty critical.
It would be on site, so it would be where you're removing the tree. Then if it required preservation or mitigation, it would be an on-site replacement.
And that would be determined by the rating scale, the results of the rating scale, whether you were losing enough trees to mitigate?
So the rating scale is intended to fine-tune how we identify trees that are subject to preservation. So for instance, right now, it's basically anything that's a woody plant that's over 8 inches diameter breast height, regardless of what species and type and health and everything else. So we're trying to not necessarily trigger preservation requirements for trees that don't need to be preserved and may merit removal. However, for the ones that are native species in good health, we want to identify those, and then with a rating scale, you could potentially put value on the size or the type that would increase the preservation requirement. So, or mitigation, and the mitigation component is the replanting. So if you can't save it, but this tree has value, then you would be required to do a mitigation and replant. And so, as we mentioned before, sometimes that's based on a ratio. So maybe a particularly high value would require a ratio of 1 to 3. So if you remove that one tree, you replant 3. Whereas lower value trees, but still ones that would trigger the requirement would be 1-to-1 or 1-to-2. So you could kind of incentivize saving the higher value trees by that, because the higher the mitigation requirement, the more likely someone is to try to preserve the tree. But the mitigation component was really to prevent adding another barrier. Right now, the consideration bar is very low. We don't have data, unfortunately, on how many sites haven't preserved any trees, but I definitely think that it hasn't been very effective at actually getting to preservation.
Well, I'm very interested in what the rating system includes, since it sounds like we have prejudice against non-native trees, and that's not something we're trying to do in this city. So who's going to write the scale? Who's going to figure out these ratings? What's going to be included? What are the parameters for each thing that's included? And, there's a danger of who it's going to benefit, how this is written. Does it benefit developers over the CRO? I think that's a very tricky line right there. And I assume that this will still include the things that we're already looking at: waterways, wetlands, slopes of 25%, and whether or not they're significant in the stand or as individuals, those will still be included.
Yeah, those will be wrapped in. And I just want to point out that as far as who benefits, the intent is that we will save or plant more trees. So this would benefit everyone, in my opinion. And in terms of, I wanted to also comment in terms of the CRO, the climate recovery. The other thing is with requiring mitigation, there is the potential that could be wrapped in terms of the recommended replacement tree types that could better address trees that are more suitable for the climate that we can expect.
One problem, though, is that established trees are much bigger. You don't plant big trees.
This would still be more likely to preserve those trees than what's existing. It's definitely, in my opinion, an improvement over what's there now.
What happens if there's a whole bunch of trees where you want to put the land? Are those counted too?
The house, you mean?
Yeah, or the apartment or whatever you're building. If I have a big lot, I might have to chop down all the trees. How do you count those?
Well, again, it would be tree by tree based on the rating scale, and then those would be trees that would be mitigated as opposed to preserved.
And what if there's not enough land around the building? I'm glad that we're preserving more trees, great, but trees are really important.
Okay, Chris.
Thank you. This material you're bringing to us has been considered by the Planning Commission.
Correct.
Can you give me an idea of how much time the Planning Commission spent on these items, these 8 items?
On batch 2, we spent almost 2 full work sessions. We had the majority of one session, and then we had an entire second session to go over each of these issues step by step, one by one. Probably at least about 4 hours.
About 4 hours? Mm-hmm. So they went into it in pretty fair detail.
Yes.
And from what I'm hearing is the majority of these, with maybe a couple of exceptions, all had unanimous support.
Correct.
In other words, they felt it was going in the right direction. I think that's worth something, because I think the Planning Commission is a body who does a lot of deliberation and whose advice I think I take very seriously and definitely consider in terms of their perspective on things. I think the notion of whether or not we're weakening something is an interesting question, but I do agree that we're really trying to bring the clear and objective into more alignment with what the real situation is. Not one that is, well, the real situation is you want to build whatever you want to, so let's just forget it, to, incrementally what is there. And I think that's what the Planning Commission is trying to say is incrementally we think this will work, and it will work to try to balance what you talked about at the very beginning, which is the consistency with the compatibility. I don't see this as warring components where you can't be consistent and it's the enemy of compatibility. I think you can use both to actually reinforce each other, which is what incrementally I think you're trying to do. So I think that's an important element. So my inclination is to say, yeah, I'm supportive of moving these forward. I don't think this is a terrible list. I think this is actually pretty reasonable stuff. There may be things in there that I may say, you know, if it were just me, I might do it a little bit differently, but I think after the Planning Commission's consideration, and I think their negotiation on what is probably the best thing to put forward, I think it's fairly reasonable. And I understand all the different components here that can create some heartburn. But I think what we're trying to get to is the ability to develop within our urban growth boundary as much reasonable and compatible housing as we can, and not to throw up a lot of barriers. And to the degree we can get there, I think is the degree we want to try. And I think these proposals are an effort incrementally to try to get there. So I'm supportive of these. I think they're worth moving forward. And I thank the Planning Commission for the work that they did. That was not an easy thing to do.
Jennifer.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. I was going to say that, so I'm glad you did it for me. The Planning Commission, I think, spent a lot of time. I'm glad you asked exactly, because it's nice to know how much time you all have spent on this, and we rely on your guys' time and expertise, so I think you've done a great job. I had a question on the very last one. So my understanding is the Planning Commission recommended this second option where, if I'm understanding it right, essentially you're getting rid of that requirement altogether, and you're just going to rely on other requirements. Is that correct?
Correct.
Is staff planning to go ahead and do that, or are you still considering it?
This one, I mean, we are looking to you to give us the guidance on what to go forward with. But this one, because of the South Hill study policy that this is intended to implement, going forward with this recommendation, we would need to make sure that we could make findings to support that. I think that there are several overlapping requirements that we have that do get at the intent of the policy. So without having written the findings and you know, fully feeling like I can tell you exactly why, at this point I would say I feel like it's feasible.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
if we
it kind of
went
made
into
sense, but I wasn't sure if you guys had had time to go back, and the answer is not yet, but you're getting there. Great. I think these are great. I'm happy to send them forward. I think they're very supportable, and I think they've been well thought out, and thank you very much for the report. Thank you.
Okay, I have both Mike and Alan for a second round. Mike,
Thank
take it
you,
away.
Mayor. These are overarching policy directions. That's what you're asking us to do, is vote yes or no on this direction, so that you can go and develop code that supports this direction. I was asked recently if I wanted a planning buddy, a partner, as it were, on the Planning Commission to communicate more frequently with. And I said, I'm not sure that would help. But what would help is more time. Now, I know that everybody wants us to move along. I see the schedule on the back, and we've got an awful lot to get done in a short period of time to do it. I get that. I understand it. So I'm caught in a weird place right now. I'm probably going to vote no, to be consistent, because I don't know that I'm in support of all of these policy directions yet. And I need more time to know that. And I was also asked during that same conversation if I would mind not bringing back any major changes late in the game, as it were. Well, I might at this point, if we're going to push forward and start developing code, and I'm not ready to know that yet. So I'm going to vote no, because I need more time to talk about the large policy direction and be comfortable with it before sending you off to write the code and risk that I'm not going to have a major desire to change that later. So that's why I'm voting no, to be consistent with that, because I'm not ready. And I think that's the better option here. So,
Alan.
I'm kind of in the same place, but not quite exactly the same reason. Being able to be comfortable with voting on these. Some of them I feel comfortable with, some of them I don't. The three that I'm most uncomfortable with are 4, 5, and 7. 4 changes the distance for open space from a quarter mile to a half a mile. I'm not clear yet why that's a good thing to do. 5 allows for less than intensive development. I understand that's what the average is, so I kind of understand that, but not quite comfortable with it. And number 7, changing the open space requirement for PUDs from 40% to 30%. And maybe you can help address those, otherwise maybe this is one of those things that we put off for a little bit and let it simmer for council action. But can you address those 3?
Well, certainly on the quarter acre to quarter mile to half a mile change, if I could just elaborate a little bit on the reasoning behind that. The quarter mile was, again, an attempt to make a clear and objective, a measurable criterion that would relate to providing open space that was convenient and accessible. So quarter mile was determined to be what convenient is. It's arbitrary. Half a mile is for instance, a lot of neighborhood parks, like they look to put neighborhood parks between a quarter to a half a mile from all residential properties. So we felt that the quarter mile might be, again, on that easing up barriers and looking at trying to make things be a little bit more precise in application without getting rid of the whole intent of the criterion. Half a mile, which is about a 10-minute walk, in our opinion, seemed still convenient and was also found by planning commission, also felt that that was a reasonable move. And I'll also add that that was supported by stakeholders. This was one that there were 2 kind of main concepts that were supported, and one of them was to revise that quarter mile to half a mile, and then the other one was to address the scalability factor, because it's clearly an issue for a site that's only 1.5 acres or 2 acres to devote a whole entire acre to open space. So hopefully that helps understand that quarter mile to half mile change. As far as the limitation over 900 feet, you said you kind of get that. Again, this one is basically bringing it more in line with what we see come out of development from under the discretionary track. So the 2.5 units per acre is consistent with the development pattern that we see going through the discretionary track. And it would, part of our recommendation was also to include more stringent tree and vegetation preservation to kind of belt and suspender that requirement of low intensity development in that area. So it goes an extra step beyond just 2.5 units per acre in acknowledging that we also want to have extra preservation in those areas, because those areas are more visible.
And on average, that's what we're seeing through the discretionary track.
Oh, and again, as Alyssa was pointing out, the other thing with that one is to point out that the South Hill study does not prohibit development above 900 feet. It just wants it to be done at a lower intensity development. So that's that one. And then the 40% open space requirement. Again, 40% is an arbitrary number, and it's really difficult because clear and objective kind of forced some arbitrary choices when we had to first develop the clear and objective criteria. And so what we know is that the cumulative impact of several of these criteria has meant that people don't use the clear and objective PUD track nearly as much as they use the discretionary track. And so in recognition of that, that was why our original recommendation was to lower it to 30% to maybe lower the barrier, maybe not remove it, but lower the barrier. And then planning commission's, discussions went around, and again, the 2 kind of options that they chose had some stakeholder support as well. Those were discussed at the working groups, and it just wasn't as easy an issue to write a recommendation for.
And one more, number 6.
The ridgeline setback.
The ridgeline setback one. Said that the South Hill study didn't have 300 feet in it. The plan or the regulations do, code does.
Correct. The South Hill study does not require a setback from the ridgeline. There is the specific policy that it seems to come from is more related to the ridgeline trail and being able to provide linkages, or I think it was in order to ensure that properties didn't get developed that we wanted to acquire as parkland. So this 300-foot setback, again, is arbitrary. The link to the urban growth boundary is not an efficient or an effective tool because the urban growth boundary does not follow the ridgeline in all places. And so that's why this one, it recognizes that there may be ridge lines above 900 feet in elevation and makes it a more precise application of this criterion so that we're maybe protecting and having a setback from those areas above 900 feet where the urban growth boundary goes through, but doesn't affect as much the lower elevation properties that this South Hill study policy didn't seem to intend to apply to.
Okay, I still have a lineup of folks. I'm just going to jump in for a minute, both with a time check, but just to say a couple of things. So I have Betty and Emily wanting a second round. Mike wants a quick point with a third round. We're at almost about a half hour late. So I'm going to keep going because it feels like a critical conversation. I don't want to cut it short, and I apologize to the next topic. I just want to summarize what I'm feeling and hearing about this, which is that this is an attempt to reconcile a 40-year-old refinement plan with new, clear, and objective standards, that the goal is to make this landscape more predictable and aligns with our goals with the housing tools and strategies, which is how do we reduce some barriers for developers so going into a project, they know what they're going to face, and they don't have to go through a prolonged process that the discretionary requires. So we're trying to make the clear and objective process smoother, more efficient, and more desirable for developers, so we actually know, and that's the predictability, we know what we're going to get in the end because this is what we said to the beginning, and that we are actually ensuring that we are holding to some critical standards around tree coverage, around slopes, around geotechnical engineering issues, and so on. So just wanting to keep that in mind, we're actually aiming for something that is better, more efficient, and meets our long-term goals of encouraging more housing to be built on the buildable land that we have. So just wanting to put that out there, and then I will turn over to Betty and then Emily.
Thank you. I share Alan's concerns, but I think the setback is really important for the users of the trail, both human and animal, and for the abutting properties, because if you have a natural area used by lots of people too close to houses, it creates conflict. As for the trees, you do not replace a 100 or 200 or 300-year-old tree. You can't mitigate that. I remember when all the trees were cut over where Broadway Place is now. People said there will be more trees there. I think there were some more sticks planted. I don't know. I don't see them. But you can't buy small. You couldn't afford to bring in big trees, even if you could plant them and make them live. So tree mitigation is just not practical. And as for the plan being 40 years old, I think that people were thinking of the future at the time of what might be needed in the future. It doesn't mean that it's wrong necessarily. And I want to add that I might be voting with Mike again for not unobvious reasons. Thank you.
Okay, Emily.
A quick question. Why is it 900 feet for this height stuff? Why is that the barrier?
In the South Hill study, properties above 900 feet were identified as the high view potential areas. So on average, most of our ridge lines fall on average in the 900-foot range and above. And so that's where that 900-foot elevation comes from. It's directly from the South Hill study policy.
And then number 6, what's the setback in other places? And is there a number to replace the 300 feet?
There is no setback. And under discretionary, there is no setback from the ridge line or from the urban growth boundary as this one has.
The South Hill study doesn't call for us any kind of specific setback.
No, I mean the whole city. Do we have, I know you can't build right up to the property line.
Do you mean normal, like regular property setbacks? It
So
depends
I
on
can
your
compare it
zone.
in my head.
Usually, like for low-density residential front property lines, it's a 10-foot setback, and interior lot lines are 5-foot setback.
Okay, great, because 300 feet is 3 first downs, so I can
Right.
kind of get a visual, and it's like not that huge. When do we do the rest of the 19, or are we not doing the other, whatever they were? Some of them, it says no change, but we're not going to look at them again. And there's 8 uses of add, replace, and revise. So are we going to look at them?
Do you mean the other other issues,
We had 19, and we've only looking at 11.
well, we had originally 37 key issues, and batch 1 contained the vast majority of those, and these are the 8 remaining issues. So batch 1 already, we came to you in November with batch 1, and
So this is the completion of
This is
the
the
first
completion.
19, and we've already talked about the others,
Yeah.
essentially. For the most part, I'm okay with these. I see where we're trying to go. And I'll vote for it because we have so much more review ahead of us, both forums and the Planning Commission. And then it will come back to us. So I'm interested to hear all of that. And I'm ready to go forward with hearing more criteria that I can question. Thanks.
And I will try to give more, when we have draft code, we'll try to give you more time to work on that. And my invitation is out there that if anybody ever wants to, run these more technical questions by me, feel free anytime.
I think you're doing a good job.
Thank you.
All right, I have Mike and then Alan also for a third.
Thank you, Mayor. Listen, I thought of a different way at my actual question here, so bear with me. Thank you. Am I correct in remembering that 10 years ago or whatever it was, we did not conduct ECLA on a lot-specific basis? Am I correct about that?
In some cases.
In some
it was
cases, as a
lot by lot.
percentage expressed by what percent?
That was a long time ago. I think we'd have to probably come back to you. And
It's fair to
review
say,
the-
in really the great majority of the case, we did not conduct ECLA on a lot-specific basis, right? Okay, that's the disconnect for me.
Yeah, okay. We'll get back to you.
Well,
on the
actually, I
specifics of
remember
that.
a big fight about that, and I'm pretty sure I'm right. The thing that's important about that is that we develop it on a lot-specific basis, and we didn't say how much land do we have to build on a lot-specific basis. That's where the disconnect is for me. And I think that, let me ask a better question. Moving forward with technology being so much more robust now, 10 years later, will we do all future comprehensive lands assessments on a lot-specific basis?
I'll just weigh in. I think we're going to have to get back to you on that because I don't know if the people sitting at the table know what that takes to do that. I think it's a good question, and we'll be happy to get back. And
I'm aware of several pieces of technology that allow us to do that very simply, so I'm really hopeful that we do that in the future to eliminate some of the conflicts that are inherent in this. Lastly, I've been thinking about this, and I may vote in favor of it. I know what I said earlier, but there is a robust process from here, and I noticed that this isn't done until the spring, and it could have a big effect on what actually gets built in the way of housing this year if we stall it off too long. And so I don't like a lot of the way this impacts based on I still have large questions about the policy direction that I'm not entirely comfortable with, but I think that there may be room to alter and address that in the future, so I may be willing to push it forward. Thank you.
Okay, Alan.
So a couple of things are weighing on my support of this. One is the Planning Commission's work on this. They did a lot of work on this, and almost all of these are 7061. So that weighs heavily on it. The clarifications that Janessa gave were very clear, and when you do her evaluation, and one of the criteria is clear description and persuasiveness, she gets an excellent.
You know that?
The fact that most of these things already occur, and we're not really preventing these things. So they are weakening the standards, but they're making them apply to what was happening almost all the time anyway. So it's making the development more streamlined. Although I don't think that there's going to be a whole lot of affordable housing on the South Hills. Those two things are probably diametrically opposed. And then finally, the fact that we are going to see all this come back to us as real language. These are the concepts, not the language. So we'll get to see it. So we're going to have another shot at this and public hearings on that as well. So this isn't the be-all, end-all for that. So with all that in consideration, I will be a yes vote.
Okay, does that take care of everyone's concerns? Thank you very much. And so we're ready to put a motion on the table?
I'll read the motion, even though I won't vote for it. I move to advance the preferred concept identified in Attachment B in this AIS as supported by the Planning Commission to the draft land use code writing phase.
Second.
All in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Opposed? 1. There we go. Thank you very much. Thank you. I agree. I think excellent presentation and explanation and response to our questions. So thank you very much for bringing so much clarity to this complicated issue. We have just about 20 minutes. Do we want to jump in for a little bit?
I think we should, Mayor, at least get started. We're not intending, this is really bringing back what you asked us to bring back, so that's what we're bringing back. If you want to then move, again, this forward to the next step, that would be the option that you have. So Jason can make a pretty quick presentation.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. My name is Jason Dedrick with the City Manager's Office. Here today to not answer questions on our comprehensive lands assessment, but rather to talk about our rest stop. So we were last here in November, and you directed us to come back with some options on what we could do to either our program or our ordinance that might increase the number of rest stop sites that we have available. So we returned today with some of those concepts. I'll try to move through this pretty quickly, and some of this is just review, so I'll go through pretty quickly. One important point I want to remind you of, and we'll do this every time we talk about homelessness, is to remind you of where on the homelessness sort of system we're talking about today. And we're talking down here on the alternative to shelter options. And I think what's important to note, and this ties into what you heard last night from TAC, is that our rest stop program is something that is helping to stabilize folks, to give them some stability to move on into housing. But it's possible that it may not, if we're successful with the recommendations from TAC, it may be something that we're not doing in 5 years, because everyone already has a place to go and doesn't need an option like a rest stop. It's possible we might still do it, but the important point is that where we're directing staff, resources and time right now may shift over time as our situation changes with homelessness, as we implement some of those recommendations. So I wanted to make that point. This is simply an overview of our program. Again, it's been in place for several years. We provide sort of the framework, and we have operators do most of the work around the sites. We provide some limited funding to help sites get going. And then our two big operators are community-supported shelters and Nightingale-hosted shelters. So right now, they are the operators that we have for rest stops. We do have 4 rest stops operating right now, 3 that are related to CSS, or where CSS, Community-Supported Shelters, is doing the operations, and 1 with NHS. The one point I want to make here that's changed since November is that we have expanded the 34th and Hilliard site with NHS. That site is now approved for up to 20 individuals. There are currently 12. That's sort of what they're able to operate at this time, but we're hoping, and they're hoping, to make that move towards 20. So we're already seeing some expansion of our program. And this is just a reminder of where those sites are. 3 of them clustered there in Ward 7, and then the one in Ward 2, that's the NHS site. And this slide is really just to remind you, same slide we talked about in November, but to remind you that staff has been working hard to try to find sites, and there are various things that make that difficult. But In lieu of the fact that finding sites has been difficult, we tried to empower the community with some of the information they needed to help bring sites forward. And to date, that hasn't resulted in very many sites. So we recognized that we had a limited capacity and we wanted to invite others in. But we created the handbook, which you've seen, done presentations, and really what's limiting the program continues to be the number of sites. There is a piece around operator capacity as well, because it's possible that we could identify 5 new sites today and not have operators with the capacity to go out and operate those sites. So that the fact that we are providing the program framework doesn't mean that we control all the levers that will make rest stops happen. It relies on other partnerships. So in your packet, we presented some ideas on criteria that could be changed. And we sort of spent some time thinking about the program and what's working and what isn't and what could possibly be changed. So really the information in the slides is just bringing forward what was already in your handout, in your packet as attachment F. One thing I want to point out is that some of these are items that are in ordinance, in our code, and some are merely program guidelines. So some take different action depending on the change that we're going to make. So as it relates to schools, we have ordinance language, code language that says sites should not be located, quote, close to a school. This has not been a significantly limiting factor simply because many of the sites that we've been looking at have not been near a school. And regardless of whether or not this criteria were in place, we anticipate we would always be doing outreach to schools that might be located near any potential sites. And so for all these, you have various options. One option is for sites that might be located near schools is to have any rest stop that might be in close proximity be one that might be for families. We don't really know how big of a waiting list for rest stop folks we might have that are families, but that is one possibility if you had site that were close by. So possibility to amend that language for that. As it relates to transit, this was merely a program guideline that we wanted to have sites be close to transit. Because we have an extensive transit program, this has not been a limiting factor. Many of the sites we've considered, if not all, have had good transit access. So no changes that would really help here. Residential, as you can imagine, much of our community is residential, and our ordinance says sites may not be located, quote, in a residential area. It's worth noting that even though we have, the sites we have out there may not be in direct proximity to residential areas are never far away in our community. And we have not received any complaints from neighbors once sites have been up and running, nor have we seen any increase in criminal activity. So last year we had APD sort of do a scan of some of our sites, crimes reported prior to the rest stop sighting as best as they could, and then criminal activity afterwards, and finding really no significant difference there. I would say that regardless of whether or not we have this criteria about residential areas, we will continue to do all the outreach that we typically do around potential sites, regardless of how proximate they are to residential areas. We are always going to be out contacting, whether they're businesses or residences. We're always going to be out doing that outreach regardless of this criteria. I would say this criteria is moderately limiting. And so it is possible that removing this criteria could result in some additional sites. But again, the outreach approach would not change regardless of this language. Site characteristics, this is simply a program criteria that we want to have sites that are flat, they're well drained, they're easy to get into to service restrooms or for emergency access. What's been more limiting has been wetland, presence of wetlands on sites. We've had several sites that are simply too wet in the winter regardless of the amount of improvement we could do to make them viable sites. And that's obviously something that there's nothing you can do that would change that. So that's just a limiting factor that we're working with. Council approval, this is, again, in our ordinance in code. Not going to spend a lot of time here, but just want to say that the process of getting to you and coming to the table with potential sites has not been nearly as limiting as just finding sites and having there be a decent amount of support for those sites. That is a much more limiting factor than bringing them forward to you. So certainly you have the purview to make that change. We don't necessarily think that's going to result in more sites than we currently have. Operating provisions, these are in our ordinance specify things that operators need to adhere to. This is mostly around making sure that folks are transitioning out of homelessness, that we're addressing their health and safety of individuals in rest stops. This has not really been a significant limiting factor, although this is the place where I'll note again that the ability to identify operators who have the capacity to operate sites will continue to be a potential limiting factor going forward. Ownership is a program criteria basically says that any site could be a rest stop. We have directed our efforts towards publicly owned sites, and that has been in an attempt to try to expedite the process. So when we're working with sites the city owns, the county, maybe LTD, maybe EWEB, maybe the BLM or ODOT, these are federal entities that, or state and local entities that we have partnerships with that might ease the ability to have those discussions. Trying to look at privately owned sites is a higher bar. Developing a relationship with someone, making sure they understand how everything works, that could take a little more time. So our efforts have been directed towards publicly owned sites. We could make a more concerted effort towards privately owned sites. That's going to take staff time and resource to do that. So that's not necessarily a change to our program.
Just a
Sure.
clarification on that. Actually, there are some ownership requirements in the ordinance that say that it must be owned or leased by the city, a religious institution, a nonprofit organization, or a business if the business is located in property zone, commercial, industrial. So they're not,
It's not wide open.
it's not wide open, but it's also not 100.
Super restricted, yeah.
Left.
Well, you could have.
This is in residential.
Well, you could have another governmental agency, actually. That's not, doesn't happen to be listed in there. So if we were to strike a deal with Lane County, for example, we would actually, when we had a rest stop on county property, we leased the property from the county because they weren't named in here. So that would be a good spot, maybe to relook at your language and, or decide to strike that or entirely, or add other governmental agencies in there.
One piece that we've added that is not in your packet is related to funding. So our current ordinance states that the operator will provide, quote, at no cost to the city, adequate garbage toilets and supervision. And we know that we've had funding allocated for rest stops. You just last year approved funding through the Community Safety Bridge funding. So we have funding that we can use to help get sites up and running, to help assist operators in some of those costs. And so making alterations to this ordinance language could allow us a little more latitude in what we can use those funds for, so we can target those funds in a way that it's going to get a rest stop going quicker or expanded faster. A change there could potentially help with that. So those are the all of the criteria. I will say that the three that staff at this point feels are most likely to result in additional sites would be that last language around funding, maybe opening that up a little bit. The residential requirement is something that could potentially have an impact if that were modified. And then really it was more of a program piece, but looking more at private lands, private properties or businesses than we have done. Again, even with those, we're not certain that they would result in a significant amount of sites. There's not one shining criteria that proves as the limiting factor. Really, it's a collection of things, and it may be also that with many of the things we're trying to do related to homelessness, it's just trying to find what's the place we want to spend our time on when there are so many things we can do.
And I'll just add one thing. The jumping off point for this discussion that you had at the last work session was a work session poll that was put out by Councilor Evans, and which was around removing from the code the requirement that council approve it. So that was one that originally started this conversation and was going to be the focus of your discussion. So while that doesn't serve as necessarily the barrier that staff's talking about, that is what was the jumping off point, was looking at whether that should be removed from the code and having it just delegated to the city manager.
Okay, thank you. So I have Emily, then Claire, then Mike in the queue, and then Chris.
Thank you for coming back pretty quickly. I think this is an essential topic that we're a little late in getting to. I know staff has worked hard on finding potential sites, but we haven't had a new rest stop in a really long time, and we only have 4. So, you know, some of these can be changed, but I haven't heard of any potential sites that were rejected and why, and that could be interesting. I'm in favor of pretty much what you're recommending. I would like to have families be allowed around schools. I think that we need places for families, and that would be a good spot. It's essential it stay close to transit. I would like to remove the not in residential areas because we haven't found anything looking at the lands we have been looking at. We need to keep it flat and not in wetlands. I would like to remove council approval, and one of the reasons is we need these spots, and if we have to approve, we have to wait for us to get it on the agenda. And I think we need to move as quickly as possible. I want to keep the operator contracts. We have to have some kind of interaction that works. Like to include private properties since we didn't find public ones. And I definitely would agree to more latitude in using our funding. And then I don't know, what, I have no ideas for what, because I just thought of this, but we have so much NIMBY. Is there some kind of incentive we could use to make that more acceptable, because if you don't want people to keep acting one way, if you make another choice attractive, you might actually get some change. So, other than essentially, reducing our homeless problem, which is so critical, is there something else that neighborhoods want that maybe we could tie to it so it doesn't just seem so onerous, that they would also get something? I don't have any ideas right now. I can't make that many cookies, but, something. So thank you for this work. I really want us to move fast. We need to do this. We said it's a good program, and it's not working, so we got to change something. Thank you very much.
Okay, Claire.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Emily. That's a good start on this conversation. So we're not going to have time to draft and discuss motions today, and I would really like to have that opportunity. So I'm going to ask the mayor and city manager to find time for us soon to have that follow-up piece to this conversation. So some of the things that I'm looking at, this isn't necessarily in the ordinance, but I think we need to make our outreach to nearby residents and businesses more robust than it has been. We still have people who feel caught off guard, or they live, that extra quarter mile away from the zone that we've looked at, and they still feel like they're going to be impacted by this decision. I think we need to amend the limit on sites near schools. We currently have at least one car camping site near a school. I'm not aware of it causing any problems for that. It's the one near Cesar Chavez. So I think a more rational approach there, whether it be families, though hopefully we would have better places for families for temporary shelter, but would be to limit who can reside at that stop. So it's not dedicated to families. Maybe we're ensuring that the management nonprofit, is doing background screenings and making sure that the folks who reside there are not in any kind of, predator. And what does close mean? Is that a quarter mile? Is that less? So that's too vague for me. I absolutely also think we need to amend the limit on sites in proximity to residential areas. I think that's been an unreasonable limitation. It was, trying to give credence to people's concern about having homeless folks nearby. I currently, in my neighborhood, within 4 blocks of my house, have about 5 or 6 sites of people tent camping around. Those are unregulated sites. That's all within, right outside people's front doors, so right in the residential area. We can deal with that. The newest location in Councilor Taylor's, I think it's in Councilor Taylor's ward, is right adjacent to a residential area, and we've had no negative outcomes because of that. I think we should thank you, City Attorney, for pointing out that language about who needs to own the land. I think we should expand that to other government jurisdictions. That seems very reasonable. I think we should eliminate the limitation about the at no cost to the city. When we implemented this program, it was a pilot project, and we were looking for something quick and inexpensive that didn't have to have us rejiggering our whole budget, and I think it's time to move on from that. So those are the things that I'm interested in addressing, and some of those would go out to a public hearing so we could hear back from both sides of these issues, multiple sides of this issue, on how people feel about some of these changes to the program.
Okay, Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I thought this was interesting in the residential section where you said that very few complaints from neighbors near existing sites have been raised, but you just said, is the one in Betty's ward near residential?
Correct, yes.
But the ordinance says may not be located in residential.
It's not zoned residential.
So it's not technically residential.
It's next door to,
Yeah, it's in a parking lot of I believe, a church. So it is not technically within a residential area.
Assisted living,
Assisted living, I'm sorry, yeah.
church runs.
I thought it was funny, though, in the sense because technically there's not a lot of single-family homes nearby. There's that nearby, but I would say that, of course, you're not going to have a lot of complaints if you're not citing any of them in residential. You're not going to have a lot of complaints from residents.
It's immediate-
By definition, if I could.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's all right. If I could, the point being that I believe that that's not truthful when it comes to most situations. And I suppose the anecdote I would say there is I attended the meeting in Santa Clara where there were a car camp on the LTD land for 3 cars. I attended a meeting that Paul Neville said was the most threatening public meeting he's ever been to after a career in the newspaper business. He said 3 people were carrying firearms. I didn't see them. I couldn't confirm that. I was there, but that's what he said, and he felt like it was dang dangerous because the neighbors felt threatened. Part of that was about notification, but another part of that was about what they considered was appropriate. And this was not something they felt appropriate. I heard all the comments. I was there for all of it, and I got all the email traffic. And so I guess my point would be, and by the way, yeah, in a car camp over there at Alton Baker Park, a guy got shot by the gal and killed by the gal he was staying with in the car. And that one's by a school too, and there's great concern about that. Or a child, a young person's event, location. I would suggest to you that we not reverse the issue of near residence, and the reason is because I think that the conflict that we're going to provoke in the community is not going to be small, and it's not going to be fun. I really think that the vast majority of residents would push back on that in a manner that would be unproductive for this conversation. I think there are smarter ways to go about it, so. That's my 2 cents.
Chris?
Thank you. I really appreciate the work you've done on this, and I agree we need to have another work session to start beginning to formulate the specifics on it. But just in terms of what you presented, I agree with the notion around ownership. We should definitely look for some increased opportunities around there. I agree with the funding questions. We have to be able to willing to step up to support these more robustly if we can and if we're willing to allocate the money. With regard to council approval, I could go either way on it, but I'm thinking we as the council represent the different wards and the different neighborhoods, so maybe we should still be involved in some way in those decisions, maybe not just informed, but figuring out a way we could still continue to be representative that way. I think the operating provisions need to be kept in place. One of the reasons why we haven't got as many complaints about rest stops is because they are managed and they are regulated. And I know that there's enormous numbers of complaints about unregulated and unmanaged camping. They're not rest stops, but they create the impression that they are condoned and supported camping. And I think that's what we need to be able to address, because that gets at the notion of, this is to Emily's point, if you wanted to have a carrot, what would that carrot be? And I think what neighborhoods want, at least what I hear all the time, is they want security. They want to know that those neighborhoods are safe. And whether there's a camp there or not, they want to know that somebody is paying attention and is watching and is monitoring and is patrolling. And so I think if you could figure out a way to incorporate increased security, increased monitoring, increased paying attention as part of the rest stop provision, so that if you have a rest stop, that with that comes the increased monitoring and supervision that could spread maybe beyond the borders of the camp. I don't know what that could look like, but I do know that at least the neighbors I hear from, they want more safety. They want more security in their neighborhoods. And if there was a way to blend those, that might be very, very helpful. Which gets to the question of proximity to residential. I think if you can confirm and show that rest stops, the way the city runs them, do not represent a hazard, in fact, could actually provide increased security, I think that is an argument for being able to place them more closely to residential areas. I wouldn't want to have an unregulated, unmanaged camp near me. I think that's a very volatile situation, but I think rest stops are different from that. They're not the same thing, and we need to be able to distinguish very clearly between the two and how they can be operated in a different way. So I'm not opposed to citing them in a residential area or near a residential area, but I do think we would need to be very clear and objective about exactly what those criteria would be for doing it and how it would work, and have a lot of community input. I don't want to run afraid from neighbors who want to act in a bad way. That doesn't scare me. I think we need to act for what is best in the community and what is our best option, not to cater to our worst.
Okay, hang on, I've got two more, and I may need an extension of the time for, let's see, can we do it in 5 minutes? Two more? Can
Move to extend 5 minutes.
Okay. Move to extend 10, oh, that's somebody did.
Move to extend 5 minutes or 10 minutes?
10.
10 minutes, second?
Second.
All in favor? Thank you. Okay, now I have Alan and then Jennifer.
So, thank you for this report. There's some things that we need to fix. I don't think council approval is one of the problems at all. I think actually that has not been a time constraint. It has not affected the approval, or we have approved all of them that have come up. And politically, I think it is a really bad idea. You don't want us to be in the position of saying, why is that in this area? And you saying, didn't have anything to do with it. Really bad place to put the council. Yep. I think it is essential that the council still have that final approval. It's not a time constraint. That we've approved them all. The problems are sites. We can't get sites. The NIMBY problem and the education problem are really what's standing in the way. We do need an education program about this and promoting the good examples that we have of these kind of things that are actually good neighbors. All of them have been good neighbors. None of them have been a problem. And get over that BS that all homeless people are dangerous and bad people. It's kind of like that, the Trump administration's crap about undocumented immigrants. One person does something bad, so then they all get painted with that brush stroke. And that, I think, is a terrible thing that we're doing in this country. Your neighbor's much more likely to shoot his partner and inside his house than a homeless person is to be violent. So that education process about what homelessness means, most of the homeless people are kids and troubled people. But I think we do have some issues around the sites. The funding issue needs to be addressed. We should be able to do that. Proximity to schools. Oh, and by the way, pet peeve, when we do modify these, please don't use the phrase close proximity, because when you look up proximity, the definition says next to or close. So close doesn't mean anything. So funding, schools, residential areas, and ownership are I think, are the key areas. But the second biggest problem besides the NIMBY issue and the education part, getting to sites, is operator capacity. I think we're either at or above the capacity of this community and the partners that we have to do any more of these. And unless we foster some way of creating that more capacity, we can't add to this system. Hopefully the stuff that we're doing with the TAC report ends up making this all a moot point in 3 to 5 years, but in the meanwhile, we need to build that capacity. I don't know how we do that. Maybe we set up a training program and figure out how to use the people that are doing it to help create new people to do it, new businesses to do it. But that's our second biggest thing besides the NIMBY issue and the education part, to get sites.
Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. I think that anytime we put people together, there's going to be conflict. So we can't expect these sites to be perfect, just like our own neighborhoods aren't perfect. And things happen, in every neighborhood. But just if you're keeping track, real quick, so you can make your marks, I think we should look at the schools, the residential requirement, the ownership, and the funding flexibility are the ones I think are going to make the most impact. I'm also hoping that when John brings back his recommendations about the TAC report, I'm sure in there is going to be, do we need more of these, or are we going to have, at some point in these years, when are we going to need to phase these out so we can kind of have an idea of, do we need one more, two more, maybe we, because of the other things we're going to do, this is not where we should be putting our time and money. We need to shift that somewhere else so that we can know, is it worth our time to be looking for these sites if they're so difficult to find? And not now because I know we're short on time, but I would love to get, why have we always had a no day use requirement? That to me, I do not like. And if there's a good reason for it, I would love to get an email of how we've justified that, because.
Okay, I think that does it for now. We're clearly needing to come back, and I just, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot you. Go for it. Oh, and yes, you're right, sorry. Take it away.
Thank you. If we need to retain council approval and we found a rest stop, how long to get it to us? Does it need a whole half a work session?
I think we would just schedule on the agenda. I do think we would bring it, I don't know if it's a work session or an action item at a regular council meeting. I think you would have some conversation, I assume. So I don't know how long it would take, but our intent would be working with the mayor and just putting it on the next available agenda item.
Well, I really think that that's important, because I think we need them now and we shouldn't be waiting. Alan, did you say that most homeless people are kids?
He said a couple things, didn't he?
That's potentially, could be true.
Have you read the point in time? Did you read the TAC report that said 89% are singles? I don't think that's true.
Depends on how you define homeless. The schools.
Maybe it depends on how you
Might be
find,
2,500.
Are we going to have a
you
debate?
define
I'm going
kids.
to let you guys have that conversation after we've closed the meeting. Do you have something?
One
else?
more thing.
Okay.
I'd like to point out that this is transitional housing, and the TAC report said we needed more of it. It's a model that we have. So I think that we should still pursue it. They could be for 6 months, a year. They're not a permanent transitional housing. So I hope we'll change some parameters. I think we really need to have more of these, and thank you for letting me speak.
Real quickly, Mayor, based on this conversation, we'll schedule another work session, and then we'll come back with some specific recommendations and/or options for you to consider, and then we can move forward. If it's an ordinance, we'll go to an ordinance process. If it's not an ordinance, we'll take some other process. But we'll come back with some specifics based on this conversation.
Okay. And I just want to put one more point out here, which is that we are going in multiple directions as a staff to work on homelessness, and there is a handbook, an outreach handbook, and it is usable by neighbors and neighborhood associations and counselors. So I'm not looking to Claire to get more rest stops in her ward. I'm sorry, that was not the wrong direction to look. But so just a reminder that finding sites is, and you all are part of that solution in terms of, given that that's the critical challenge. So thank you very much. Thank you all. And did you have something
Yeah.
more? Oh, sorry.
I put
Okay.
my hand up
Didn't
for
see
another
it.
round there.
Go for
I
it.
was going to say that despite the unfortunate nature of his comments, I agree with Alan on the issue of whether or not council should have a say and a vote on each location. I think that's wise for all the same reasons he mentioned. I also wanted to address something that was said after my comment. I don't either agree that we should make decisions based on the fear of how people respond. What I'm saying is it's unwise to walk up to somebody, slap them in the head, and pick a fight, which is what this would be doing, knowing the level of response. And I find it kind of arrogant that we would suggest that if we would just teach these people better, they wouldn't respond like that. And I'm sorry, but my comment was meant to be one that was more passive in nature, to say I don't think it's wise for us to push that very hard unless without knowing that we're intentionally creating a conflict. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. With that, we are adjourned.